with that said, there are very strong data, and I will provide links to these resources, pointing to the fact that for people who are chronic users of cannabis, that is using it twice a week or more, that over time their levels of anxiety actually increase. And this is true even for individuals that are using strains of cannabis that, while under the influence of cannabis, reduce anxiety. Over time, meaning over the course of 12 or more months, there is a well-documented effect of the anxiety relief that cannabis and THC initially brought being less and less potent. That is, people need to smoke more of it or ingest more THC in order to achieve the same level of anxiety relief. And in some cases, a switch from anxiety relief to increase in anxiety. And again, that's increase in anxiety not just when the drug is not being consumed, but also while under the influence of the drug. Why would that be? We have to go back to our understanding of the CB1 receptor and the potency with which THC binds to that CB1 receptor. When THC is brought into the system over and over again, meaning twice a week or more, the binding of THC to that CB1 receptor eventually causes a sort of habituation or attenuation of the entire process of binding the receptor and creating the psychoactive effects. So initially it creates anxiety relief, but over time, the affinity for the receptor doesn't change, meaning it can still park in that slot with a lot of affinity, a lot of strength, but there are fewer receptors available. And then the signaling that's downstream of those receptors becomes less and less robust. Now, this is a topic we didn't get into in too much detail today because I didn't want to include even more biological detail, but the CB1 receptor is a so-called G protein coupled receptor. That's a mouthful, but a G protein coupled receptor basically is like a bucket brigade. So while some receptors in the brain and body are such that when a chemical binds to them, that receptor has a direct action, like it opens and allows stuff to rush into the cell, increases the excitability of the cell, so-called fast effects. These G protein coupled receptors, and CB1 is a G protein coupled receptor, they are more like a bucket brigade where they kick off a process through one molecule that then is handed off to another molecule, that this then is handed off to another molecule. It's a long chain or cascade of events. Those long chains or cascades of events have a lot of opportunity for regulation, for adjustment. You know, receptor systems in the brain and body, especially receptor systems like the cannabinoid system that are used to being kind of tickled, not punched, tickled by endogenous cannabinoids. Every once in a while, some binds, has an effect, but certainly not bound with incredible potency and over again as they are when THC is coming into the system. Well, those systems eventually over time, they adjust themselves so that the body and those cells can achieve so-called homeostasis. So when people are using THC more than twice a week, what ends up happening is those G protein coupled receptors and the downstream signaling mechanisms start to adjust themselves, and it requires more and more drug, so either higher dosages or more frequent use. And a lot of the positive effects, the so-called decrease in anxiety, increased focus, increased creativity, some of that starts to wane. It starts to dissipate, and people wonder why they have to use so much cannabis just to achieve a fraction of the effect that they used to be able to achieve with even a lower dose. So anxiety is getting worse over time, and that's anxiety during the drug use and outside of the drug use. Some people work around that or try to work around that by using varying strains of cannabis or changing the pattern of delivery from smoking to vaping, or from vaping to edible, and from edible to transdermal. Anyway, they go through a lot of gymnastics and writhing and seeking, but nonetheless, anxiety increases over time. Also, it's very clear that depression increases over time, and especially, this is surprising to me, but especially for individuals that were not depressed at the outset of their use. In other words, they didn't start using cannabis because they were depressed, but rather the depression starts to emerge as a consequence of the cannabis and THC use. So that's serious. In fact, we now know, based on really solid epidemiological evidence, that depression is not a strong predictor of seeking out cannabis. It doesn't drive terribly many people to seek out cannabis use. But cannabis use itself makes people 4 times likelier to develop a chronic major depression. So anxiety is increasing, depression is increasing, and this turns out to be especially relevant and important to young people. Why do I say that? Well, if you look at the data, and again, I think some of the strongest data are data to come out of the Canadian system. They've done some really beautiful controlled studies. I really hope to invite some of the people who arranged and ran those studies as guests onto the Huberman Lab podcast. But if you look at the data out of Canada, or you look at some of the data out of Northern Europe and the US, what you find is that the probability that somebody will use cannabis and then go on to use it chronically correlates very strongly with age. So for instance, some of the highest degree of cannabis use is among individuals 16 to 24 years old. In fact, in individuals who are 16 to 24 years old, and in particular in students and people who are working, surprising, more than in unemployed populations, being young, 16 to 24, at least to me that's young, and being a student or working doubles the likelihood that somebody is going to use cannabis on a regular basis, twice or more per week. The typical age of initiating cannabis use nowadays is about 19 years old, so 18.7. And about 20% of people in that age bracket of 16 to 24 years old are using cannabis daily, either by vaping, by smoking, or by edible. That's an enormous number, at least by my read, it's an enormous number. And here's why it's of really serious concern. During the ages of 16 to 24, the cannabinoid receptors are still available. They are not being as strongly driven by endogenous cannabinoids, but by ingestion of THC and or CBD, there are downstream effects on the signaling within those cells that all the data point to creating a much, much higher likelihood of developing major depression, severe anxiety, or psychosis at later ages. To be very clear, cannabis use between the ages of 16 to 24 in both males and females is increasing anxiety, increasing depression in the immediate years and within the 1 year's time or so, so much so that people are using the cannabis ongoing in an attempt to reduce that anxiety and reduce that depression. But in addition to that, the cannabis use, and because of the signaling mechanisms involved, are predisposing those individuals to psychosis later in life. If you look at individuals who start using cannabis even younger, age 14, or even as young as 12, the probability of psychosis later in life, in particular schizophrenic or schizophrenic-like episodes, more than doubles. So this is of really serious concern. And this is completely aside from any so-called positive effects or beneficial effects of cannabis that people might derive from occasional use as adults, meaning people older than 25. So for the person who's older than 25 who, eats an edible every once in a while or who smokes cannabis every once in a while, and, people love to make the argument, it's not as bad as alcohol, right? Which frankly is a terrible argument because if you saw our episode on alcohol is pretty bad. But even so, it's just not a good argument. Saying that something is good because it's not as bad as something else is simply just not a good or valid argument, at least not biologically speaking. The use of cannabis in young populations is very strongly predisposing people to psychotic episodes. And we know the mechanism by which this occurs. This occurs by a thinning of the so-called gray matter. And it's called gray matter because with neurons, nerve cells, they have a so-called cell body. That's the part that contains the DNA and manufactures all the neurotransmitters, et cetera. And those are shipped out to the other parts of the neuron that include the axon, the wires between axons. And those axons under the microscope, because they have a lot of fatty tissue around them, and this is healthy fatty tissue that allows electrical transmission to be fast, that fatty tissue, those portions of the cells are called white matter. So you have gray matter and white matter. Gray matter are the so-called cell bodies where the DNA and all the stuff is manufactured. White matter are the axons or the wires through which all the key components are shipped out to the synapse, et cetera. Wonderful data, and I do say wonderful because this is part of a large-scale consortium, and we will provide a link to the paper. This was published in Translational Psychiatry just this year. Point to the fact that adolescent cannabis use accelerates the thinning of the prefrontal cortex and the gray matter in particular. So what this means is, while during normal development, the gray matter, the prefrontal cortex, and all the cells there are indeed intended. It's a normal process for it to thicken and then thin a little bit as connections are adjusted and people learn and mature and grow up. This is part of the normal, healthy maturational process, independent of cannabis use. When kids, because these really are kids, use cannabis, and it doesn't matter the mode of cannabis delivery, whether or not it's vaping or smoking or edible, that gray matter thins at a much, much greater rate. And the reason I like this paper published in Translational Psychiatry this year so much is that they link the amount of cannabis use, heavy, moderate, light, or no cannabis use, to the rate of prefrontal cortical thinning. And it's absolutely clear from these data that the more often young people, meaning individuals between the age of 14 and 25, the more often they consume or smoke or vape cannabis, the faster and the more extreme that cortical thinning is. And the cortical thinning is occurring in exactly the area of the brain that's involved in planning, in control over one's emotions, in reflexes, in organizing one's life in a number of different ways, anywhere from cleaning one's room, literally, knowing what goes where, to making plans that extend out through the day, through the week, through a year. Essentially becoming a functional human being involves using your prefrontal cortex in a variety of different contexts and different sort of time domains, the time domain of an hour, the time domain of a day. Making plans and being able to execute plans is fundamental to being a healthy human being. And it's absolutely clear from these data that the more cannabis one uses, the more impaired those neural circuits are. There's simply no other way to view these data. In fact, so much so that even small amounts of cannabis use are associated with rates of cortical thinning and degrees of cortical thinning that are really detrimental and concerning for normal cognitive processes. If you were somebody who smoked marijuana or consumed cannabis in any form or another during adolescence, does that mean that your prefrontal cortex can never be rescued, that it can't come back? Well, the short answer is it probably can be rescued to some degree. It will depend on how much cannabis you were using and how often and what strains of cannabis, et cetera. There's really no traveling back in time. As my graduate advisor used to say, time machines are broken. At least for now, we don't have time machines. So all you can really do is try and emphasize, first of all, quitting cannabis in any form and focusing on behaviors that emphasize endothelial cell blood flow health to the brain. So that would be cardiovascular exercise, adequate nutrition, not smoking nicotine. And there are a number of other things that one can do. We will do an entire episode all about trying to reverse the effects of cannabis and other drug use during adolescence. We don't have time to do a deep dive on that right now, but all the things that standardize and kind of promote health, adequate sleep, good social connection, regular cardiovascular and weight training exercise, healthy nutrition, what that represents to you, healthy metabolic function and weight, et cetera. Those are all going to facilitate some recovery of brain function, in particular prefrontal cortical function, by way of all the positive effects that those behaviors and choices have. But with that said, if you are in the age bracket that I've been referring to, this 14 to 25-year-old age bracket, and you are a occasional even or chronic cannabis user, you should be very, very careful and concerned about the long-term effects that could potentially have. That statement is bolstered by another statistic, which is that unlike a lot of other drugs, the rate of cannabis use is strongly related to how dangerous people perceive cannabis to be. Now, that might seem obvious on the one hand. If you think something is very, very dangerous, you would expect that the probability that somebody would use it would be very, very low. And if they think something is safe, the probability would be high. But that isn't necessarily the case. If you think about it, cannabis is a unique instance in which nowadays we are hearing, yes, it's becoming legal in a number of areas, and we talked earlier about why that's probably a good thing in most circumstances, but that we aren't just hearing that cannabis is safe, or it's not just being implied that cannabis is safer, but many more people are talking about the positive effects of cannabis without a lot of discussion about the negative effects of cannabis. And I realize that saying this is going to upset some people out there, because I know that there are a number of people who fought very hard for the legalization process, and I want to acknowledge that. I also want to acknowledge the many known positive effects of cannabis in adults with very occasional use, provided it is delivered safely and in the safe context and setting and with legality. That is entirely distinct from the issue of whether or not cannabis is safe for the developing brain and body. Again, I'm not demonizing anybody for using cannabis, but I want to make the point very simply and very directly. It is far and away a different circumstance for the brain for an individual to be 25 years or older and using cannabis in whatever form occasionally, or maybe even frequently, than it is for a young person aged 14 to 25 to be using cannabis either by smoking or vaping or by edible or any other form on the brain and body. It's absolutely clear that the brain continues to develop at least until age 25, and that a huge number of systems related to mood regulation, so-called executive function, the ability to organize one's thoughts, plan, and execute plans, essentially to become a functional human being, right? That's one portion of becoming a functional human being, but certainly an essential one. All of that relies on the fine-tuning of this neural circuitry that we've been talking about up until now. And it's abundantly clear that cannabis and THC in particular dramatically disrupt those processes. So if this isn't clear enough just from my statements, I'd like to point to a particular paper. This is one of the more impactful papers in this area in recent years. This is a paper published in Lancet Psychiatry in 2022. The title is Association of Cannabis Potency with Mental Ill Health and Addiction, a Systematic Review. There are a number of very important points in this very fine paper. Lancet Psychiatry is one of the premier medical journals out there. And they evaluated a huge number of studies. They actually looked at more than 4,000 studies. They selected the ones that were only the most rigorous in terms of study design and analysis and rigor of conclusions. And they looked at how early use of cannabis impacted later probability of development of psychosis and other psychiatric conditions. And the takeaways from this study are very clear. First of all, chronic cannabis use, so more than twice per week, has consistently been associated with mental health disorders. I'm pulling some phrases directly from the paper. Heavy cannabis use, meaning cannabis use more frequent than twice per week, has been associated with 4 times the risk of psychosis later in life, in particular schizophrenia and bipolar-like episodes. Now, we've done an episode on bipolar disorder, so-called bipolar depression. We have not yet done one on schizophrenia, but both bipolar disorder and schizophrenia have a very, very strong genetic component. There's a 30 times greater likelihood that you'll have bipolar disorder if you have a first relative who has bipolar disorder. And then it's also the case that using cannabis, especially during adolescence and the teen years and up until age 25, create a 4 times greater risk of psychosis for those that have a predisposition to bipolar disorder and or schizophrenia. Now, I don't hear very much about this in the media. This paper got some attention and then it sort of got swept away. I don't think that was an intentional sweeping away. There's just a lot of events in the world, as you well know. But I think it's a particularly important set of findings because obviously in looking at so many studies, it distills out the strongest findings that are out there and really pulls the consistent messages that are arriving from all these different studies. And as they point out, and again, I'm paraphrasing here, this is the first systematic review of the association of cannabis potency. And all of the data point to a very clear conclusion, which is the more potent the THC concentration, the higher probability of developing psychosis or a major depressive episode or a major anxiety disorder later in life. That should be of particular concern because we are absolutely clear about the fact that with the advent of all these new strains of cannabis and with the engineering and availability of cannabis at much higher potency, meaning THC potency, the risk of psychosis is going up and is likely to continue going up unless something is done to reduce the frequency of cannabis use to 0, ideally, or to very low frequency, very low potency in adolescents and teens and people aged 25 or younger. I know a lot of people don't want to hear this message because, first of all, it's alarming. And second of all, as I mentioned earlier, The statistics tell us that the greatest number of people that are starting to use cannabis are in the age bracket of 16 to 24. Many of them are functional in other areas of life. They are students, they are employed, etc. But when you couple that with the fact that the most frequent adopters of cannabis use are in this age bracket of 16 to 24, they're twice as likely to use as other individuals or to start using cannabis as are other individuals, plus the general perception out there because of the way that cannabis is discussed in the media and by sports figures and by celebrities and by politicians, etc., that it's not as bad as alcohol and maybe not that bad and maybe even has health benefits, then you're essentially setting up a system where young people are far more likely to adopt and continue cannabis use without realizing these serious health consequences that await them later. With all of that said, I, of course, again want to acknowledge that there have been well-demonstrated effects of cannabis for reducing pain, in particular in chemotherapy and in the context of reducing nausea in people suffering from cancer chemotherapy. There is a well-known effect that one can generally point to as positive in using cannabis for things like glaucoma, for lowering intraocular pressure and offsetting the loss of neurons that would lead to blindness, although there are other tools, of course, that don't involve cannabis use that can accomplish that as well, so-called intraocular pressure lowering drugs or drops. There is a list of probably a dozen or more psychological and bodily ailments that can be aided by cannabis use, in particular edible cannabis use of particular strains. I, of course, am going to address each and every one of those in episodes where I'm talking, for instance, about eye disease or about chronic pain. I am in no way, shape, or form trying to rob the incredible efforts of the laboratories and people that have worked very hard to study and establish the valid uses of cannabis for treating various ailments and that continue to study cannabis in order to try and ameliorate the symptoms of different ailments. But today I really wanted to emphasize the biology of cannabis, some of the often discussed effects, I guess one could call them positive effects, things like enhanced creativity, and really point to the nuance and actually the divergence of people who take cannabis, and some experience heightened levels of creativity and some do not. Some people experience heightened levels of sexual arousal and some people experience the exact opposite, and so on and so forth, rather than focus on all the potential positive and sort of emerging positive data about cannabis in different medical contexts. And at the same time, I strongly feel that it's important to acknowledge the shocking, because there's really no other way to describe it, the shocking effects of cannabis use on the developing fetus and the fact that so many pregnant and lactating mothers are using cannabis. I mean, that number 15% still has me, dizzy with kind of disbelief, and yet we need to acknowledge this and address this immediately. And I think it's vital to understand that cannabis use through any delivery mechanism, smoking or vaping or edible or otherwise, is very, very concerning, in fact, dangerous to the developing brain, certainly for the fetal brain and for the baby brain, but also for the adolescent brain and for the teen and young adult brain, not just because of the effects that it can have in the immediate term, those slow creeping increases in anxiety and depression brought on by cannabis use, but also the time release, if you will, on the development of psychosis and other types of major psychiatric disorders later in life.